Hello, welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. So I took a little break last week. I decided to not do a projection show for last weekend just because the only wide release coming out was Incarnate, and I didn't want to waste my time with it. And rightly so, it did terrible, like I thought it would. But I'm back. We're going to review the last weekend here, December 2nd through the 4th. Pretty interesting week, just because it was mostly all holdovers. We're going to walk through the top 10, maybe talk a little bit in depth about Moana, and maybe like Arrival, just a couple of deep dives. And then I'll sort of tee up this upcoming weekend. Well, there's only one major release, Christmas Office Party. So let's go through the top 10 here real quick. Coming at number 1 last weekend was Moana. This is the Disney animation film that is doing quite well. It came in with 28.27 million, which is pretty good, a 50% drop. That's not too bad. It's currently sitting at a total gross of $119 million. This is just its second weekend. I'm kind of split on the performance of this film. I think on the one hand, when the numbers first were coming out over the Thanksgiving weekend, everything seemed to be going quite well with it. It almost felt like it almost beat Frozen for the 5-day Thanksgiving record. But for some reason, it seems to be tapering off, and I'm not really sure why. A 50% drop for its second weekend is not terrible. I was expecting more like a 40% drop. I know that might be kind of like outrageous just because last weekend was a holiday, but children's films like this, especially a movie that, if I'm mistaken here, I think it has a 96 rating on Rotten Tomatoes, a 93% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, cinema score of an A, I believe. So this is an incredibly popular film and widely regarded as a very, very good movie. And not only very good in terms of quality, good in terms of entertaining, and it has the marketing arm of Disney behind it. So you would expect this film to sort of get its talons into audiences and just stick around for a really long time. You know, also being a children's film, they tend to have very, very good drops for, super long amounts of time. I'm trying to think back to look at the big movies this summer or this year even, with Zootopia, Finding Dory, Secret Life of Pets. These movies crushed, and they crushed for 4 straight months. It was really fantastic to see. So I thought Moana was going to be similar to that pattern of high quality animated film that everybody loves, sort of hanging on, 30-40% drops for 6 weeks, 12 weeks, something like that. I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. And I really noticed it too, because I invested a lot of money on it on Hollywood Stock Exchange, which of course is the fantasy stock market for movies. And I put a lot of money into it, expecting it would close out after 4 weeks. Stocks on the fantasy game essentially close out. I was thinking, oh yeah, at least do 200 million after 4 weeks. It doesn't look like it's going to do that anymore. And I'm thinking it's looking like 180 for the 4-week mark. Eventually it will pop over the 200 mark, and then people are saying 250. I don't know. I really haven't done the math enough to see what I think it's going to hit at the end of the day. But it now looks like the 200 million mark after 4 weeks doesn't look actually that doable. So something's happening with this film. Something's going on with Moana. And I don't know if it is the fact that the main character is Polynesian, if that has any effect on the audiences in the United States. Obviously we're going through a weird cultural moment with Trump becoming president, where racism and sexism seem to be a lot more out in the open. And I don't know if the fact that Moana, the girl in the film, the main character, isn't the white girl in Frozen, if that has a detrimental effect. When you're looking at this stuff from a business analytic perspective, you have to take cultural viewpoints into account. And I can't sort of negate that and say that may not be an issue. I think it might be an issue, sadly. So we'll see where Moana goes. I have hope that the drops will start to get lower and lower. I'm hoping for a 35% drop this next weekend. There's not much coming out. The only big thing coming out is Office Christmas Party. So I'm hoping it can start to lower those drops a bit and just hang around for a really long time. But of course, it's going to run into the juggernaut of Rogue One, which comes out in about a week and a half now. And I think Rogue One's just going to slay every film out there. But Moana is kind of counter programming to that to some degree. So I hope that it'll hang on here, but a decent second weekend for Moana, not outstanding, not terrible. Just really pretty good. Coming at number 2 for the weekend was Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. This is the Harry Potter universe film. Came in at $18 million this weekend, a 60% drop. That's pretty big. It lost a few theaters, lost about 150 theaters. Its per theater average is down to about $4,500 per theater. Its total so far is $183 million for the domestic take. I kind of wonder what it's doing worldwide on that. Let me check that real quick. Oh, it's at $600 million worldwide. And that, oh man, I love these Harry Potter films. From just an analytic perspective, because their domestic versus foreign gross is so outrageously different than normal films. Like right now, it's basically 70% international, 30% domestic. I think it'll stay that way. That's really weird. Usually, like the most you'll get is 60% international take, 40% domestic. And when I say domestic, I mean that's Canada and the United States. So really interesting film. Fantastic Beasts making a ton of money worldwide, doing okay here in the States. At the end of the day, I think a couple episodes ago, or maybe last episode, I sort of projected this at like at least a $50 million profit, probably more in the $70 to $80 million profit range. I think Warner Brothers wanted it to get past that $100 million profit margin. It might. I'm just using sort of guesses based on past blockbusters. But I think that the end story of Fantastic Beasts was, okay, like this is a successful film within the Harry Potter franchise, but not Harry Potter, so they can keep making these, I think. I think the next time they make a film like this, they got to work on the marketing a little bit more. I felt like the marketing for Fantastic Beasts wasn't terrible. It was just kind of like meh, very tepid. And I think that costed a lot of casual viewers going. I think everybody who loves Harry Potter went to go see it, but it didn't pull in like the casual viewer. Then that's what puts a movie going from pretty successful to being a huge blockbuster. So decent for Fantastic Beasts at number 2. Number 3, Arrival, just will not go away. Keep sticking around. $7.2 million. Fantastic 36% drop. Really, really good. I think the last weekend I had a 5% drop. And what this is even blowing my mind too, it actually increased theaters. It increased 473 theaters last weekend. And this is in its 4th week. You don't see that very often. Usually you're going to start out the most theaters you're going to be at, and then slowly but sure you lose them. In this case, Arrival is it's sticking in there like a champ. It's at $73 million total. Its per theater average is around $2,500 for the weekend. So very good stuff. Really happy for that film. I haven't seen it yet. It's definitely at the top on my list to see. I've been stoked for that film since I saw the trailer. Actually, before I saw the trailer, when I heard the synopsis of it, I was like, this is going to be awesome. I know it. And apparently audiences are really super into it. So great job for Arrival this last weekend. And then a number 4 slot, we have Allied. This is the Robert Zemeckis film. This one's doing okay. I really bashed it last week. Just because it had a huge budget, $85 million budget. Brad Pitt, Robert Zemeckis. You expect this to do at least low 20s, mid 20s. 20 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, you would expect this to do $30 million opening weekend. Just times have changed, audiences have changed, and culture has changed. And it did only about $7 million this weekend. It's its second weekend. 44% drop. That's not too bad. What that basically says to me is that there was an audience for Allied. It's just a small audience. And that audience seemed to really like the film. And they're probably not going to go away. They're going to keep coming to see it. But obviously it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that drop's not terrible. Now, if the drop was like above 50% or like 55%, almost to 60, then you'd be like, this is just like a bad product, just a bad idea. I think what you can honestly blame Allied's sort of middling performance, I would say actually poor performance, is bad marketing. I think the film itself is probably pretty decent, and audiences have indicated that they liked the film. The marketing for it and getting butts into the seats is where they failed on this. The marketing was just, I think, honestly awful. It made it look almost like I would rather take an Ambien than go and watch this film, was essentially the message I got from the trailers. But it's sticking in there now, $7 million. Its total so far is $28 million. It should have made that its opening weekend, but it didn't. I think it will, because it is really good counter programming. Allied and Arrival are like two of the only really sort of wide release adult films, people over 30 can go see. So I think it will stick around for a while, but it's not going to make anywhere near what it needed to make to pull a profit. It will be a loss for Paramount. And it's sadly a really bad loss for Robert Zemeckis as well. Brad Pitt, he'll just do other movies. He doesn't really care. Doctor Strange at number 5, 6.7 million, a good 50% drop. It's starting to lose a little bit of theaters, lost about 70 theaters this weekend. Its total so far, it's $215 million in its fifth weekend. Doctor Strange doing quite well. A big success for Marvel. You got to remember that the last, I think, character they launched would have been Ant-Man. And that ended up at about $180 million. So Doctor Strange is well past that right now. I think it had a bigger budget than Ant-Man, but I think it's definitely, at the end of the day, quite a success for Marvel. Another notch in their belt with several notches already. Coming at number 6 this weekend was Trolls, $4.7 million. Kind of a big drop, 55% drop. Starting to lose theaters, about 170 theaters. Its per theater average was pretty bad at about $1,500. I think Trolls is a success. I hate to say that because I think the whole concept of the film is stupid. But Fox did a good job marketing it. They did a great job with getting Justin Timberlake to do that song. And ironically, I think that song, I Can't Stop This Feeling. Yeah. The song was released way back in the spring. Like I remember it coming out in like March, and I was like, it's a really good song. I'm not gonna lie, it's a really good song. It did a good job of getting this film in people's heads way before it was coming out. So I think that's actually had a lot to do with its success. Now, is it an overwhelming success? No, I think it's like a really good performance for the film. And the budget was $125. It's already at $141 domestic. Obviously, that's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's doing pretty well. Coming at number 7 was Hacksaw Ridge, the Mel Gibson film, with $3.3 million. A nice 39% drop. Really good. Also added theaters, added 162 theaters. It is up to $57 million. That is an awesome performance for that film. And I was looking at the Rotten Tomatoes scores recently for just what audiences were thinking. Kind of outrageous. Hacksaw Ridge had an 86% in terms of the critic score, but audiences gave it a 95% liked it. That's a really awesome score, even higher than Moana. Also great counter programming for the holiday season. Definitely adult film. I expect Hacksaw Ridge isn't going away. I feel like, Oscar nominations don't come out till I believe late to mid-January. So it's a whiles away. I do think it'll be up for a lot of awards. And I think it's just going to keep sticking around for a long time. So a really good comeback for Mel Gibson. I think he's going to start making a lot more movies again. I think he got it. He got his get out of jail, not really get out of jail free card, because he was kind of blacklisted for about 10 years. But now he's back in the game, in the Hollywood game. until he screws up again, probably. In any event, number 8 was Bad Santa 2. This is the Billy Bob Thornton sequel to the 2003 Bad Santa. $3.3 million. Not a terrible drop, 46% drop. Added about 25 screens this weekend. Sadly, though, that per theater average means it is going away fast. Only had about a $1,100 per theater average. So movie theaters are going to want to get that out of there ASAP, especially with Star Wars coming up. They want to book up half their theaters for Rogue One. I don't think Bad Santa's going to stick around much longer. It was a small budget, though, only $26 million budget. Total take so far, $14.2 million. Not a big international market for this film, so I think it's going to end up being a pretty decent loss. For whoever put it out. Who did put that out? Who's BG? I don't know who this is. Oh, Broad Green Pictures. They're like a brand new production company, distribution company. They only have 6 films, I think, out so far, maybe? Yeah, that's it. Wow. Well, that's too bad. I don't think if they keep putting films out like Bad Santa 2, they're not going to be around for a long time. Coming at number 9 was our only wide release opener, Incarnate. I don't know anything about Incarnate. Do I want to know anything about Incarnate? I don't know. It made $2.5 million this weekend. Aaron Eckhart's in it. Brad Payton directed it. He did San Andreas last year. I don't know what happened with this film. Got put up by High Top Releasing. That's another sort of newer production company, distribution company. They put out Green Inferno. And I think that's the only other film that anybody would probably recognize. They have a lot more coming out next year, I know. There's a lot of these upstarts, these little startup production companies, which I love, which I predicted like 10 years ago, not 10 years ago, like 7 years ago. I was like, okay, like Hollywood clearly doesn't get what's going on with the internet and streaming and Netflix. They don't get it. They're a decade behind. Even if you're a year behind, you're going to get screwed. And I think they're getting to the point where they're going to get some real competition from people like A24 or Bleecker Street, who are going to come along and make these really fantastic, high quality films that are going to start eating away at the big studios here. And I think you're starting to see these little tiny ones start to prop up like High Top Releasing. And I think they're eventually going to get a lot bigger over the next 5 to 10 years. And we're going to see some really big new names within the next decade releasing films in theaters. Do I really need to talk about Incarnate? I mean, what's there to say? It was a stupid horror film. Did $2.5 million. It was released on 1,700 theaters. Its per theater average was $14.59. I mean, it's just awful. Like, why? I guess it was only made for $5 million, but like the marketing budget alone on that had to be really high. Although I did hear that they went more the social media route for marketing Incarnate, and obviously that's going to reduce your cost, dramatically from running TV ads and print ads and stuff like that. But it still cost them millions of pounds, probably like $12 million, $15 million, maybe $20 million to market. They're not going to make money on that. Coming at number 10 was Almost Christmas, also $2.5 million, 55% drop. Lost about 200 theaters. Its per theater average was about $1,600. I guess this one's doing pretty well. There's only $17 million to make. Its take so far is $38 million in its 4th weekend. The thing about Almost Christmas is now we're close enough to actual Christmas where people are going to go see this, not more than they have seen it already, but there's still going to be an audience for this, I think, through the end of the year. So I think it's going to stick around maybe in the top 15 until the new year. Maybe. That's the top 10. A couple of other things I want to point, or movies outside the top 10 I want to point out, just to sort of discuss a little bit. Manchester by the Sea. This is the Casey Affleck, Michelle Williams film. Tons of buzz from Sundance. I mean, it was like deafening when it came out. It's doing quite well. It made about $2.3 million this weekend on only 156 screens. So its per theater average was really up there at about $14,000, almost $15,000 actually. It's done $4.3 million so far in its 3rd weekend. This is one of those movies that was put out in limited release in the big cities, and now they're experimenting with putting a lot wider. I'm not sure what they're going to do with it this weekend, if they're going to pump it up, because it added 100 theaters last weekend. I don't know if they're going to keep going with it. The cool thing about that film is, or at least the pattern that I'm seeing, is that high per theater average. Now, obviously, when you're talking limited releases, the per theater average is likely to be a lot higher than your normal movies. Like if you look at this weekend, Fantastic Beasts and number 2, its per theater average was $4,500, right? Number 1, Moana, was $7,300. You know, Manchester by the Sea is doubling that. And so it can be a little bit misleading. $14,000 per theater average for a limited release on 150 screens is pretty darn good. It's not outrageously good. I'm sure when this film started out, and I can look to see what it did, its initial weekends. Its first weekend, it was only on 4 screens, probably New York and Los Angeles. Its per theater average was $64,000. So like it just gets, the rule of thumb here is the smaller the number of screens, usually the average shoots way up. And also because those markets that they're getting released in the limited theaters are usually these super dense cultural centers like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, whatever, Miami, where they're just going to make more money because people are clamoring for artistic films like this. So it'll sell out, all 4 shows, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, just because there's a market for it. So Manchester by the Sea is doing pretty well. I wonder if it's going to be able to hang on for a few more weeks and then maybe stick around even for the Oscars. I think Casey Affleck's going to get a nomination. I believe him and Michelle Williams both got runner-up at the LA Film Critics yesterday. So there's definitely some buzz about the film doing well. Now, are we talking Best Picture here? I think maybe yes. I think they might do it. I think they're going to get acting awards. I think Casey Affleck is basically a shoo-in for Best Actor at this point. If that is the case, then this film will stick around a lot longer and might even see that Oscar bump in mid-January when they release the nominations. But no, it's doing quite well. It'll be really fascinating to see how this does this next weekend. Like, are they going to pump this out to like 500 more screens? And then if they do, what's going to happen to that per theater average? I know that the wholesalers and film distributors are looking at these per theater averages and basically be like, can I make money off of this film this weekend? And they have to make that call along with, the film studio. And I kind of wonder where that point is for some of these films. Like, and I'm speaking specifically in terms of that per theater average. Like, it's at $14,000 now. Let's say next weekend they pump it out to 200 more theaters, and that starts to drop down to like $7,000. Now, is it worth it to keep releasing that film to more theaters, or is that where you want to sort of cut it off? It's almost like this wave that comes in, and like, where does it stop? I'm not sure where it's going to stop for Manchester by the Sea. I think there is a market for it in some of the bigger cities and sort of, we'll call it middle America, like where I'm from. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I could definitely see that playing in downtown Milwaukee, obviously in Chicago, Minneapolis, Omaha, St. Louis. It definitely seems like a film that could do well in those areas, but it's got to make money. So we'll see what happens with that. I'm really excited to watch that film and see how it does. Edge of 17, $1.6 million. It's in 12th place, decent drop. Too bad the per theater average is $1,000. That's done. It's done. It was on 1,600 theaters. Compared to Manchester by the Sea, it's only on 156 theaters. Like, it's outrageous. It's like, why would you super wide release Edge of 17 and not do that to Manchester by the Sea? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't know. It's SDX, and they're like a kind of a newer company that has a lot of cash infusion from China. So I think they're playing around with stuff and they're experimenting. I don't think the experiment for Edge of 17 went very well. It made $12 million total. I just don't think that's going to be a success for them. It looks like it should have been more of a VOD release, or maybe even like an HBO or something like that. Other sort of highlights from the top 30 here. Moonlight is still sticking around. Its total take so far is $9.8 million. That was definitely a limited release, and they started to bump it up on theaters. It was over about 600 theaters at a time, but now that per theater average is under $1,500, so it's going to start to go away. Also to note, like coming up this weekend, two movies are going wide that have been pretty limited. Nocturnal Animals, that's the Tom Ford film with Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal. That's been doing, I don't know why they're going super wide with that one. Like that feels like a New York, LA, San Francisco film. Just let it play there. Try and get your awards for it. That's it. It's at 127 screens now. I can't remember what the number is. Maybe they have it on Box Office Mojo here to see what they're going to release it to super wide. They don't have it here. I know somebody said I was going super wide. I could be full of it though. I'm kind of like wondering what their strategy is for that. Like if the per theater average, is already down to $5,500 on only 127 screens. This is a perfect example of comparing limited releases to kind of get an idea of how they're doing. If I compare the per theater average of Nocturnal Animals, this tiny little art film from Focus Features, versus Fantastic Beast, its per theater average is better, but it's only on 127 screens. Now, if I can compare Nocturnal Animals to Manchester by the Sea, same amount of theaters, Manchester by the Sea has a per theater average that is basically triple Nocturnal Animals. So yeah, like the business decisions that are being made, obviously I'm an amateur, I'm not in the business, I don't know what's going on in the background, but to bump up Nocturnal Animals to wide, and I got to figure out if that's true or not because I read that somewhere, doesn't really make a lot of sense to me because there's no way it's going to hold a decent per theater average if you added it to more than like 600 theaters. It just seems like a bad idea to me. Also going wide release and also a bad idea is Miss Sloan. This is the Jessica Chastain film about, I guess, a gun control sort of a lobbyist advocate or something. It's been playing limited for the last 2 weekends. It opened up on the 25th, the sort of Thanksgiving weekend. Opened up on 3 theaters, was on 4 theaters this weekend. Its per theater average was $11,000 for this last weekend, which is not terrible. It just doesn't make a lot of sense then. Why would you want to push it out to a super wide audience this weekend? It kind of baffles my mind. So those are 2 movies to watch. We'll see what happens. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Like maybe Miss Sloan will do quite well on 1,500 theaters this weekend, and maybe Nocturnal Animals will knock it out of the park. Based on the numbers that I'm seeing, and that's strictly the per theater average, I don't see that happening, and I see them disappearing from wide release quite quickly, especially when when Rogue One comes in and knocks everybody out. The only other movie I'll talk about in terms of just last weekend was Jackie. This is the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis biopic. Is that her name? Did I get that name right? It's with Natalie Portman. I think that this is going to perform decently. I don't see it expanding that much though, and actually she'll get an Oscar nom. But I don't think that it's going to stick around that long. Its per theater average was $55,000 this weekend, but it was only in 5 theaters. So that was lower than Manchester by the Sea. I expect that they will start to kick it out to more theaters here next weekend. But I don't think that performance is good enough to really get it going. It should get a best acting nom, but that's all this film's going to do. Jacqueline Kennedy. What is her last name? Onassis? I should know this. Like, my family basically worshipped the Kennedys. Whatever. I'll figure that out later. So that's basically the rundown of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Okay, I was right. I got to trust myself more. In any event, that's the rundown for the weekend. I think the big stories here are Moana's doing pretty well. Not as well as I think a lot of people had hoped it would do. It's not going to be a Frozen, obviously. It's hard to, equate the two because Frozen was this like huge, crazy phenomenon that happened. But I do think Moana should have done better than it's doing right now. Arrival sticking around really well, doing awesome. Hacksaw Ridge as well. A lot of movies are going to be disappearing pretty soon. Bad Santa 2 is going to be out. Incarnate's going to be out soon. And we'll see how these limited releases, as they go a little bit wider, perform. Manchester by the Sea is probably going to do the best out of all of them, but we'll see how Nocturnal Animals and Miss Sloan does as they go wide. And I'll do a brief little preview of this upcoming weekend. The big movie coming out is Office Christmas